Hi everyone. Tonight, we're trading central heating for a smoky longhouse, your mattress for a straw-stuffed sack, and your sense of personal space for 11 relatives, 3 dogs, and a very opinionated goat. Welcome to Viking Age, Scandinavia. Not the horned helmet, pillaging on command version Hollywood sold you. I mean the real thing. Farmers who happen to be extraordinary sailors, a legal system argued out loud in a field, and a level of home insulation that mostly involved hoping for the best. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying yourself. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the middle of the night somewhere. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that low, steady hum, and settle in. Ideally somewhere with better ventilation than what you're about to hear about. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually smelled like inside a house with one small hole in the roof and a fire that never went out? Could you survive a Scandinavian winter sharing one room with your entire extended family and their livestock? Would you have the stomach for fermented fish, the patience for an assembly-style legal trial that could last a week, or the nerve to cross open ocean in a boat with no roof? And could you tell the difference between a respected merchant and a raiding warrior, when honestly, some mornings, neither could they? And now, congratulations! You've just woken up on a farmstead somewhere on the coast of Norway. The year is 793. Smoke is already stinging your eyes, someone is arguing about a goat, and a ship is being prepared down by the shore. Welcome home. Try not to get seasick. Let's talk about waking up, because it is not a gentle process. There's no alarm clock here, no soft chime easing you into consciousness. There's a rooster somewhere outside losing his mind, a baby crying 2 platforms down, and someone's elbow lodged firmly in your ribs because personal space, as a concept, has not been invented yet and will not be invented for roughly 1,000 years. The air is thick, damp, and smells like a combination of wet wool, last night's fish stew, and the faint, ever-present tang of livestock. You blink against the gloom because the only light source is that stubborn hearth fire and whatever grey dawn manages to sneak through the smoke hole in the roof. Getting up means untangling yourself from a pile of blankets, siblings, and possibly a sleeping dog who has claimed your legs as personal property overnight. There is no privacy, no separate bedroom, no door you can close and pretend the rest of the household doesn't exist. The Longhouse is one long room, sometimes 60 or 70 feet from end to end, and everyone in it, grandparents to toddlers to farmhands, wakes up together, dresses together, and starts the day together, whether they like each other or not. Ever tried getting ready for work while your entire extended family watches you fumble with your shoes? That's every single morning here, minus the shoes, because shoes are leather and mildly precious, and you're more likely to be lacing up soft hide boots than anything resembling a sneaker. The women are usually first up, coaxing the hearth fire back to a proper blaze, because a fire that's gone fully out overnight is a genuine crisis, not a minor inconvenience. It means striking flint against steel, catching a spark in a nest of dry tinder, and nursing that tiny ember like it's a fragile, temperamental houseguest who might leave in a huff if you breathe wrong. Once it catches, The whole room slowly wakes up around it, the smoke curling upward, everyone shuffling closer for warmth, because outside that fire circle, the air in a Norwegian longhouse in, say, February, is not what anyone would call cosy. You pull on your tunic, still slightly damp from yesterday, because clothes dry slowly in a house with one exit for air and roughly 40 living things breathing into it at once. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is whatever's within arm's reach, and there's no dawdling over it, because the animals need tending, the fields need checking, and somebody's already arguing about whose turn it is to muck out the stalls. And here's the strange part. Despite the smoke, the noise, the complete absence of anything resembling quiet, there's a kind of stubborn coziness to it. The warmth radiates outward from that fire. The voices, even the grumpy ones, are familiar. You are never, not for 1 second of the day, alone. Which sounds exhausting until you remember that in a world with no locks, no police, and the occasional roaming bear, being surrounded by people who'd fight for you is actually the entire point. So you cough once, rub the smoke from your eyes, step over the dog, apologize to nobody in particular, and join the slow, shuffling, smoky business of starting another day. Waking up in the modern world will never quite feel the same after this. At least your alarm clock doesn't have opinions about the goat. Let's talk about that fire properly, because it deserves its own moment of respect. It sits low in a long stone-lined trench running down the centre of the room, more like a fire pit than a fireplace, and it burns constantly, day and night, for the entire winter, sometimes for years without ever fully going cold. Keeping it alive is a genuine skill, passed down and practiced daily, because relighting a fire from scratch with flint, steel and patience is a slow, fussy business nobody wants to repeat more often than necessary. Someone is always assigned to watch it, feed it, coax it back up when it dips, and bank the coals properly before everyone settles in for the night, so there's still a live ember waiting in the morning. It's less a chore and more a sacred responsibility, the kind of job that if you mess up, the whole household notices immediately, because a cold hearth in the depths of a Scandinavian winter is not a minor inconvenience, it's a survival emergency. Ever left your phone charger at home and felt that flicker of panic? Multiply that by roughly 1,000 and you're getting close to what a dead hearth fire meant here. The smoke from that fire has nowhere elegant to go. There's a hole in the roof, called a smoke hole, directly above the hearth, and the theory is that the smoke rises and drifts politely out through it. In practice, a good portion of it just hangs in the rafters, curling through the beams, blackening the wood, and settling into every fibre of clothing, hair and food stored nearby. This is, somewhat incredibly, considered a feature rather than a bug. Smoke helps preserve meat and fish hung up near the roof, drives away insects, and honestly, everyone in the house smells like campfire all the time anyway, so nobody really notices anymore. It's the Viking Age equivalent of a candle labelled Cozy Autumn Evening, except it's just what your house permanently smells like, whether you wanted that or not. The fire is also, quite literally, the centre of social life. Meals are cooked over it in an iron cauldron hung from a chain or tripod. Meat and root vegetables and grain simmering together into a thick stew that gets ladled out to whoever's hungry, which is everyone, always. In the evenings, once the day's work winds down, the household gathers close around that same fire, warming hands, mending tools, and listening to whoever feels like talking that night. Light from the flames dances across carved wooden beams and the faces of people who've shared this exact spot every evening of their lives. There's an intimacy to it that modern living rooms, with their separate screens and separate corners, can't really replicate. You're not just near your family here, you're bound to them by heat, light, smoke, and the shared understanding that if that fire goes out, everyone suffers together. So the next time your thermostat clicks the heat on without a second thought, spare a thought for the fire watcher, quietly feeding twigs into a smoky pit, keeping an entire household alive, one careful breath at a time. It's the original smart home system. It just requires you to personally negotiate with the flames. Let's talk about your roommates. Because in a great many Norse farmsteads, the livestock didn't live in a separate barn down the path. They lived right there with you, often at the far end of the very same long room. This wasn't laziness or poor planning. It was, in its own strange way, brilliant engineering. Animals generate heat, quite a lot of it actually, and in a climate where winter can mean weeks of bone-deep cold, having your cows, sheep, goats, and the occasional pig breathing warmly at one end of the house while your family sleeps at the other is a genuinely effective form of insulation. You're basically living inside a very large, very fragrant space heater. The layout is simple enough. A low wall or partition, sometimes just a change in floor level, separates the human living quarters from the byre, where the animals are stabled. But sound travels freely, and so, unfortunately, does smell. You fall asleep to the low shuffling and occasional grumbling of livestock a few dozen feet away. The soft thud of hooves on packed earth, the rustle of hay, and yes, on a still night, everything else that comes along with keeping animals indoors. Ever complained about a neighbour's dog barking through a shared wall? Try sharing your actual living room with a cow who has feelings about the weather. Caring for these animals isn't a side chore either. It's central to survival. Cattle provide milk, which gets turned into cheese and skyr, a thick, tangy dairy product that keeps for months and shows up at nearly every meal. Sheep provide wool, which is spun, woven, and stitched into every single piece of clothing in the house. An endless, ongoing project that never technically finishes. Goats browse on scrub too tough for anything else to bother with, and pigs, when the household can afford them, root around for whatever scraps and forage they can find. Every single animal earns its keep, and every single animal is, in some sense, a member of the household, which makes it slightly awkward when winter arrives and some of them become dinner. There's no sentimentality wasted on this. Livestock numbers are carefully calculated each autumn, based on how much hay and fodder has been stored, and any animal that can't be fed through the winter gets slaughtered, smoked, salted, and turned into the food supply that keeps everyone else alive until spring. It's a brutally practical arrangement, but one that makes complete sense when the alternative is starving animals and humans both. The smell, admittedly, takes some getting used to. Manure, damp hay, animal sweat, and wood smoke combine into an aroma that would probably horrify a modern nose within about 4 seconds. But to everyone living here, it's simply the smell of home, the smell of warmth, the smell of a household that's managed, once again, to make it through another brutal winter, with its animals and its people both still breathing. So next time your neighbour's barking dog interrupts your evening, remember that somewhere back in the 9th century, an entire family was falling asleep to the gentle snoring of a cow they'd absolutely trust with their lives. It's not glamorous. It's just extremely, aggressively efficient. It's time to get dressed. And here the priorities are refreshingly simple. Stay warm, stay dry, and try not to look like you rolled straight out of a haystack, even though, functionally, you kind of did. The foundation of nearly every outfit here is wool, spun from the household's own sheep, woven on a large, upright loom that dominates one corner of the Longhouse, and worn in layers because a single layer of anything is a losing bet against a Scandinavian winter. Men typically wear a long-sleeved wool tunic over linen trousers, cinched at the waist with a leather belt, topped with a cloak fastened at the shoulder with a metal brooch or pin. Women wear a linen underdress, over which goes a longer wool overdress, suspended by straps and fastened at the chest with a pair of oval brooches, which sounds decorative until you realize those brooches are also load-bearing, holding the entire garment together, along with a chain or string of beads draped between them, from which useful items like scissors, keys, or a small knife might dangle. It's less a fashion accessory and more a fully functional utility belt worn at chest height. Ever seen someone's keys clipped to their belt loop and thought that looked practical? A Norse woman was doing exactly that, just several centuries early, and with better jewellery. Fabric here isn't cheap or quick to produce. Turning raw wool into a finished garment takes weeks of labour, carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving, all done by hand, which means clothing is valuable, mended rather than replaced, and passed down when it still has wear left in it. Dyes come from local plants, roots, lichens, and bark, producing a range of surprisingly vivid colours: deep reds, warm yellows, rich blues from imported woad, though the deepest, most saturated colours are the most expensive and tend to signal status. A farmer in undyed, natural wool and a wealthy trader in imported blue linen are, technically, wearing the same basic silhouette, but everyone in the room knows exactly who's who. Footwear is soft leather, turned and stitched inside out so the seams don't dig into the foot, more like a sturdy moccasin than a boot, which offers surprisingly little protection against mud, ice, or the general chaos of a farmyard. Jewellery matters enormously here, not just for looks, but as a portable, wearable form of wealth. Silver arm rings, neck rings, and brooches can be cut apart and used as currency when needed, meaning a well-dressed Norse man or woman is, quite literally, walking around wearing their savings account. Grooming, contrary to old stereotypes, is taken seriously too. Combs carved from bone or antler are common personal possessions, kept close and used often. And there's decent evidence that regular bathing, at least weekly, was more the norm here than in a lot of contemporary Europe, much to the visible discomfort of a few disapproving foreign chroniclers who wrote about it with real suspicion. So you finish dressing, brooches pinned, belt cinched, comb run quickly through your hair, and step out into the yard looking, by the standards of the age, entirely respectable. It's practical, it's durable, and it's proof that you can absolutely look put together without a single mirror in the house. Let's talk about breakfast, though calling it that might be generous, since there's no clear morning-specific meal here, so much as food, eaten whenever hunger and the day's demands align. Whatever survived the winter stores makes an appearance. Porridge made from barley or oats, thick enough to stand a spoon in, often sweetened slightly with honey if the household's bees have been generous, or left plain and hearty if they haven't. Alongside it might sit dried or smoked fish, hanging from the rafters most of the year and torn off in strips, tough and salty, and packed with the kind of protein that gets you through a full day of hauling, chopping, and hauling some more. A wedge of hard cheese, aged and sharp, rounds things out, along with flatbread, baked on a hot stone or griddle from coarsely ground flour, dense and chewy in a way that would probably confuse anyone used to a soft supermarket loaf. And to wash it all down, there's almost certainly something fermented, because the water situation here is, politely, a gamble. Rivers and wells can carry all sorts of unwelcome surprises, so a mild, lightly alcoholic drink made from fermented grain or whey is often the safer, more reliable choice. Even at breakfast, even for children, in smaller, weaker portions. Ever complained that your coffee wasn't strong enough this morning? Somewhere in 9th century Norway, a 10-year-old is drinking watered-down fermented barley with their porridge and calling it a normal Tuesday. There's no sitting down to a leisurely meal at a table set with matching dishes. Food is eaten quickly, often standing, often mid-conversation about the day's chores, using a personal knife pulled from your belt and a wooden bowl or trencher that does double duty as plate and cutting board. Sharing is the norm. A big pot of porridge gets ladled out to whoever's around, and there's an unspoken understanding that everyone eats roughly the same food, master and servant, farmer and farmhand, because the household's food supply is a shared, finite resource that has to last through a genuinely unforgiving winter. Preserving that supply is a year-round obsession. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermenting are the only tools available to keep food edible for months at a stretch, and the household's entire survival hinges on getting those preservation techniques right. A poorly smoked side of fish or an improperly salted cut of meat isn't just a wasted breakfast. It's a genuine risk to the household's ability to make it to spring. This is part of why skyr, that thick, tangy, yogurt-like dairy product, becomes such a staple. It keeps remarkably well, provides real nutrition, and can be flavoured with whatever berries happen to be in season. Lingonberries or cloudberries foraged from the surrounding forest and hillside. It's not a bad breakfast, all things considered. Hearty, practical, and built entirely around what the land and the animals were willing to provide that particular year. There's no menu, no substitutions, no complaints tolerated about portion size. You eat what's there, you're grateful it's there at all, and you get moving. Because the barley isn't going to harvest itself, and neither, unfortunately, is that fish you'll need for next winter's breakfast. It's time to talk about farming, because before anyone becomes a raider, a trader, or a famous poet reciting verses by the fire, they are, overwhelmingly, a farmer. And the entire Viking Age runs on the back of agriculture, not adventure. The soil across much of Scandinavia is thin, rocky, and stubborn, carved by glaciers into narrow valleys and coastal strips, where good farmland is a genuinely precious commodity, fought over, inherited carefully, and never taken for granted. The growing season is short, squeezed between a long winter and an early autumn frost, which means every single week of decent weather matters enormously. Barley is the backbone crop here, hardy enough to survive the cool climate, useful for both bread and that ever-present fermented drink, alongside rye, oats, and, where the soil allows, a bit of wheat for special occasions. Ever felt stressed about a work deadline? Try planting an entire year's food supply within a window of maybe 10 good weeks, with absolutely no room for a bad harvest. Because a bad harvest here doesn't mean tightening the household budget, it means genuine hunger by February. The fields are worked with simple wooden ards, a kind of early plough that scratches rather than turns the soil, pulled by oxen where the household can afford them, or by sheer human effort where they can't. Everyone contributes. Men, women, children old enough to carry a tool, because there simply isn't enough labour to spare anyone the work. Alongside the crops, livestock rounds out the farm's survival strategy. Sheep graze the rougher hillsides where crops won't grow, providing both wool and meat, while cattle, more valuable and more demanding, are kept where pasture allows, providing milk, cheese, and the occasional roast when winter culling comes around. Goats handle the scrubbiest land of all, and pigs, if the farm is prosperous enough, forage for scraps and acorns in nearby woodland. Managing all of this requires a kind of constant, rolling calculation. How much hay can be stored? How many animals can be fed through winter? How much grain needs to be set aside for both eating and next year's seed? get the math wrong, and the consequences are severe. This is also, notably, work that doesn't stop for anyone's absence. When the men of the household sail off trading, raiding, or exploring, and this happens often, sometimes for months at a stretch, the farm doesn't pause and wait for them to return. It falls, quite naturally, to the women of the household to run the entire operation, managing the fields, the animals, the storage, the labour, and every single decision in between. A level of responsibility and authority that would surprise anyone still picturing Norse women as decorative background figures. The farmstead, in the end, is the actual engine of this entire society. The ships, the raids, the trade routes, the sagas, all of it is funded, fed, and supported by fields of barley and herds of sheep, tended by families who understood, better than almost anyone, that glory doesn't feed a household through a Scandinavian winter. Grain does. And so does an extremely judgmental sheep, glaring at you from across the pasture like you've personally wronged it. Down at the shore, let's watch a ship take shape, because this, more than raids or reputation, is the single greatest achievement of the entire Viking Age. Norse shipbuilders work without written blueprints, relying instead on skill passed down through generations, eyeballing proportions with a precision that would make a modern engineer nervous. The process starts with the keel, a long, single spine of oak laid first, from which everything else grows outward and upward. Planks are split, not sawn, from oak logs, following the wood's natural grain to produce boards that are lighter, stronger, and more flexible than anything cut against the grain would allow. These planks are laid overlapping, one over the next, a technique called clinker building, riveted together with iron nails and corked with tarred wool or animal hair to keep the whole thing watertight. The result is a hull that flexes slightly with the waves instead of fighting them, giving these ships a kind of living, breathing quality on open water that stiffer designs simply don't have. Ever tried assembling flat-pack furniture with instructions that seem almost deliberately unhelpful? Now imagine building an ocean-going vessel with no instructions at all, just muscle memory and centuries of trial and error, and somehow getting it exactly right. The smell down at the shipyard is a mix of fresh-cut oak, hot tar bubbling in a cauldron for waterproofing, and the salt air rolling in off the water, while the sound is a steady rhythm of mallets, axes, and men calling out measurements to each other across half-built hulls. Different ships serve different purposes. The longship, sleek, narrow, and built for speed, is the one that shows up in every dramatic depiction, capable of both open ocean crossings and, crucially, sliding right up onto a riverbank or beach without needing a harbour, which explains an awful lot about how surprise raids manage to work so effectively. The Gnar, broader and deeper hulled, is the true workhorse of trade, built to haul cargo, livestock and settlers across genuinely vast distances, all the way to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Building either type takes months of skilled labour and represents a serious investment for any farmstead or chieftain, which is why ships, much like land, get passed down, cared for, and repaired rather than casually replaced. Sails, woven from wool and often treated with fat or tar to help shed water, catch the wind, while a bank of oars gives the crew power when the wind refuses to cooperate, which, this being the North Atlantic, happens often. The finishing touch on a proper longship is the carved prow, sometimes shaped into a fearsome dragon or serpent head, meant partly to intimidate enemies and partly, quite sincerely, to ward off evil spirits lurking in unfamiliar waters. Launching a new ship is a genuine community event, celebrated with feasting, and sometimes, according to later written accounts, a ritual sacrifice to bless the vessel and its coming voyages. Whatever the specifics, everyone understands the stakes. This ship isn't a hobby project or a weekend build. It's about to carry people's lives, livelihoods, and futures across some of the most unpredictable water on the planet. And it had better be built right the first time, because there's no roadside assistance waiting out there in the middle of the North Sea. Once the ship's in the water, someone actually has to sail the thing, and this is where things get genuinely nerve-wracking, because there is no compass here, no map with helpful little dotted lines, and absolutely no GPS quietly recalculating your route. Navigation runs entirely on observation, memory, and an almost unreasonable amount of confidence. By day, sailors read the position of the sun, tracking its arc across the sky to estimate direction and rough time, while by night, the stars offer a more reliable, if occasionally cloud-obscured, set of markers. There's also strong evidence for a clever tool called a sun compass, or sun shadow board, a simple disc marked with notches that, when the sun casts a shadow across it, helps a navigator hold a steady course, even on a long, featureless open water crossing where land hasn't been visible for days. Ever gotten mildly anxious when your phone's GPS glitches for 30 seconds in a parking garage? Now imagine crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean with nothing but a stick, a shadow, and the unwavering confidence that you memorized the right landmarks correctly. When the sky clouds over entirely, which in the North Atlantic happens with irritating regularity, sailors turn to other clues. The color and temperature of the water, the pattern and direction of swells rolling beneath the hull, the behavior of seabirds, since certain species tend to stay relatively close to land, and a sharp-eyed sailor watching their flight patterns at dawn or dusk can get a decent read on which direction shore might lie. There's even a persistent legend about using ravens, released from the ship to see which direction they fly, on the theory that a raven will beeline toward the nearest land rather than circle uselessly over empty water. Whether this was common practice or a colourful bit of later storytelling is genuinely debated, but it captures the spirit of the whole enterprise perfectly. Use every available clue, trust your instincts, and commit fully once you've made a decision. Crossing open water this way isn't a casual afternoon sail. Reaching Iceland or later Greenland means days, sometimes weeks, of being entirely out of sight of land, at the mercy of weather that can shift from calm to violent with almost no warning. Sailors navigate by dead reckoning, carefully tracking speed, direction, and elapsed time to estimate position, a method that demands constant attention and leaves very little room for a wrong guess. Get it wrong, and you might miss your destination entirely, drifting into open ocean with dwindling supplies and no real way to course correct beyond hope and careful observation. And yet, astonishingly, it works, again and again, carrying Norse sailors to Iceland, to Greenland, and eventually to the shores of North America, centuries before anyone else in Europe managed the trip. It's a testament to genuinely extraordinary skill, hard-won knowledge passed down through generations of sailors who understood the ocean's moods better than most people today understand their own commute. So next time your GPS reroutes you around traffic without a second thought, spare a moment of respect for the sailors who crossed an entire ocean using a shadow, a bird, and sheer, unshakable nerve. Here's the thing nobody tells you about a Viking Age sea voyage. The same ship, the same crew, and sometimes even the same afternoon could turn into a raid, a trading trip, or simply a very assertive social visit. And honestly, the distinction often came down to how the initial conversation went. Approaching an unfamiliar coast, a Norse crew would typically size up the situation first. Is this a well-defended town with soldiers visibly patrolling the walls, or an isolated, poorly guarded monastery sitting temptingly close to the water? Is there an established trading relationship already in place, or is this genuinely unfamiliar territory? The answer shaped everything that happened next. If the opportunity for quick, valuable plunder looked good and the risk looked low, a raid might follow, swift, violent, and over within hours, the crew grabbing silver, portable valuables, and sometimes captives before pushing back out to sea before any organized resistance could gather. Monasteries were particularly frequent targets, not out of any specific religious animosity, but because they were, quite simply, soft targets loaded with precious metal, undefended by soldiers, and often sitting right on an exposed coastline. Ever had a co-worker who was perfectly polite in the office, but turned into a completely different person the moment there was free food unattended in the break room? That's roughly the energy here, minus the mild judgment and plus considerably higher stakes. But raiding was never the whole story, and honestly, wasn't even the main story for most Norse sailors most of the time. Plenty of these same voyages were fundamentally commercial, involving established trade relationships built up over years, where Norse merchants brought furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves to trade for silver, silk, wine, and glassware from markets stretching from the British Isles to Byzantium. A returning voyage might involve months of careful, patient trading, building relationships with foreign merchants, negotiating fair prices, and returning home with goods that would fund the household for years. The same ships that occasionally raided were, far more often, simply doing business, and the same crews capable of sudden violence were, most of the time, perfectly reasonable trading partners who understood that a good ongoing relationship with a foreign market was worth infinitely more than a single opportunistic grab. There was also genuinely, a whole category of voyage that was just exploration and settlement. Families packing up entire households onto a nar and sailing off toward Iceland, Greenland, or beyond, seeking new farmland rather than plunder or profit. What ties all of this together is a simple, practical mindset. The sea offered opportunity, and Norse sailors were remarkably flexible about what form that opportunity took, adjusting on the fly based on circumstances, defences, and relationships already in place. It's less Vikings were raiders and more Vikings were opportunists with excellent boats, which is a considerably less cinematic tagline, but a far more historically honest one. So the next time someone shows up to a party and can't quite decide whether they're there to socialise or to raid the snack table, know that they're carrying on a very old, very Norse tradition. If raiding isn't your speed, and honestly, it shouldn't be, there's perfectly honest commerce to be had at a proper trading town, and few places capture the chaos and energy of Norse commercial life quite like Kaupang, tucked along the Norwegian coast. Walking into a market like this assaults every sense at once. The smell hits first, tar and wood smoke from nearby workshops mixing with fish drying on racks, animal hides freshly tanned, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of too many people crammed into too small a space, all trying to strike a deal at the same time. The sound is a constant overlapping hum of bargaining, laughter, the clink of silver being weighed, and voices in languages you don't recognise. Because merchants here travel from remarkably far afield. Frankish traders, Frisian cloth dealers, and further east, Arab merchants whose silver coins, called dirhams, turn up in Norse trading towns with genuinely surprising frequency, evidence of trade networks stretching all the way to Baghdad. Ever tried navigating an airport terminal where half the signs are in languages you can't read, and everyone seems to be in a slightly bigger hurry than you? Now do that, but the departure gate is a rowboat, and the currency exchange involves a small hanging scale and a very serious argument about purity. Because that's the other crucial detail here. There's no standardized coinage system tying all of this together. Instead, silver is weighed, using silver folding scales that merchants carry with them everywhere, precise little instruments that determine exactly how much a piece of hack silver, chopped up jewellery, coins, or ingots is actually worth by weight and purity rather than face value. A merchant who can't accurately judge silver content, whether by weight, by biting it, or simply by experience, is a merchant who gets cheated fast. So this is a skill taken extremely seriously. Goods flowing through a market like Kaupang are genuinely impressive in range. Furs from the far north, walrus ivory prized across Europe for carving, soapstone vessels, iron tools, and enslaved people, an uncomfortable but very real part of Norse trade economics, move outward, while silver, fine textiles, wine, glass beads and spices flow inward. Craftsmen work right there in the town too, not just traders passing through, and you can watch bronze casters, comb makers, working bone and antler into fine-toothed combs, and jewelers hammering silver into brooches and arm rings, the raw materials for tomorrow's wearable savings account. There's a rough seasonal rhythm to all of this. Trading towns swelling with activity during the warmer months when sailing is safest, then quieting considerably as autumn approaches, and merchants head home before the seas turn genuinely dangerous. Disputes, and there are plenty, given the sheer volume of strangers, silver and alcohol involved, get settled through a mix of reputation, negotiation, and occasionally the threat of violence hovering politely in the background, since a trading town's entire prosperity depends on maintaining enough order that merchants keep coming back season after season. It's chaotic, multicultural, and remarkably sophisticated for a society that gets stereotyped as unwashed barbarians with axes. In reality, it's a bustling international marketplace with quality control standards stricter than a lot of modern online shopping. Just try returning a faulty item here, though. The customer service policy involves considerably more shouting. Let's talk about how disputes actually get settled here, because it is absolutely not a king pointing a sword and making a unilateral decision. It's the thing, spelt with a capital T and pronounced roughly like the word you'd use for an object. A regular public assembly where free men from across a district gather, sometimes for days at a stretch in an open field or designated meeting spot, to argue, vote, negotiate, and settle disputes ranging from minor property disagreements to full-blown blood feuds. This isn't some vague, informal gathering either. The thing operates on established custom and law, memorized and recited by a designated law speaker whose entire job is to know the rules by heart and recite them aloud at each assembly, since almost none of it is written down. Ever sat through a genuinely endless HOA meeting where everyone has strong opinions about the fence height and absolutely nobody wants to compromise? The thing is that, except the stakes might include actual bloodshed, and the meeting can last considerably longer than anyone's patience should reasonably allow. Attendance isn't optional for free men with a stake in the community, and the gathering serves as far more than a courtroom. It's also where marriages get arranged, political alliances get formed, news and gossip travel between otherwise isolated farmsteads, and young men build the kind of reputation that matters enormously in a society built on honor and standing. Cases get presented publicly, witnesses called, evidence weighed, largely through spoken testimony and community knowledge, rather than anything resembling written documentation. And decisions are reached through a mix of established legal precedent and, frankly, a fair amount of social pressure and negotiation happening on the sidelines. There's a real democratic quality to the whole affair that tends to surprise people who assume this era ran purely on brute force. Free men, meaning those who weren't enslaved and held enough social standing, genuinely had a voice here, could speak, argue their case, and vote on major decisions affecting the community. Women, notably, could bring cases to the thing as well, particularly regarding property, divorce, or inheritance disputes, even if the assembly itself was overwhelmingly attended and dominated by men. It's not a perfect or fully equal system by any modern measure, but it's a genuinely functioning form of collective self-governance, built on consensus and precedent rather than a single ruler's whim, at a time when a lot of the rest of Europe was operating under considerably more top-down feudal arrangements. The setting itself carries real weight too. Many things convene at specific, recognized locations, sometimes near a significant natural landmark, a particular hill, rock formation, or grove, treated with an almost sacred seriousness, since this is where the community's collective sense of order and fairness gets hashed out, argument by argument, case by case. Feasting, trading, and socializing happen alongside the formal proceedings, turning what could be a tense, adversarial gathering into something closer to a community festival, with legal proceedings woven throughout. People catch up with distant relatives, strike business deals, and yes, occasionally settle old grudges, sometimes peacefully, sometimes considerably less so. So the next time jury duty feels like an inconvenience, imagine instead a multi-day outdoor assembly with no bathroom breaks, no lunch recess, and the very real possibility that losing your case might end in a feud lasting 3 generations. Suddenly, a folding chair in a fluorescent-lit courthouse doesn't sound so bad. Justice in this world runs less on prisons, which barely exist in any organized form, and more on compensation, a strict, almost mathematically precise system where the value of an insult, an injury, or even a life can be calculated down to a specific amount of silver. This is called vergild, literally man price, and it's one of the more fascinating quirks of Norse law. Instead of locking someone away for causing harm, the law instead establishes exactly how much that harm is worth, and the offending party, or their family, is expected to pay it. Kill someone's relative in a fight, and rather than facing execution automatically, you're facing a debt, a very specific, very serious debt owed to the victim's family, with the exact amount depending on the social standing of the person killed. A wealthy landowner's life is worth considerably more, in strict legal terms, than a farmhand's, which sounds harsh until you realize this is basically an early, blunt version of how a lot of modern legal and insurance systems still quietly calculate the value of a human life anyway, just with less silver changing hands directly. Ever gotten a parking ticket and thought, at least this is a flat, predictable fee and not a lifetime prison sentence? Congratulations! You've just accidentally endorsed the basic logic of the vergild system. Failing to pay this debt, or refusing to acknowledge the wrong committed, is what tips a dispute into a full-blood feud, and this is where things get genuinely dangerous, because Norse society takes personal honour extremely seriously, and a family that doesn't seek proper compensation or revenge for a wrong done to them risks looking weak, which in this culture is arguably worse than looking violent. Feuds, once started, can drag on for years, even generations. One act of retaliation prompting another in a grim, exhausting cycle that the Thing Assembly often exists specifically to help interrupt and resolve before it spirals completely out of control. A skilled negotiator, sometimes a respected chieftain or law speaker acting as mediator, can broker a settlement, an agreed payment, a formal reconciliation, a marriage between families to cement peace, all designed to end the cycle of violence before it consumes an entire community. Outlawry is the other major tool available here, and it's a genuinely severe punishment despite involving no physical violence at all. Being declared an outlaw means being stripped of all legal protection. Nobody is obligated to feed you, shelter you, or defend you, and anyone can kill you without facing consequences because you're no longer considered part of the legal community at all. For a society this dependent on kinship, mutual obligation, and community standing, outlawry is, in some ways, a fate considerably worse than a quick execution, a slow, grinding erasure of your entire social existence. Property, too, factors heavily into legal disputes, land boundaries, inheritance rights, and marriage contracts, all governed by established custom and enforced through the same thing assemblies, with witnesses and precedent doing the work that written deeds and courtrooms handle today. It's a system built on the assumption that everyone in the community knows everyone else, remembers past dealings, and has a personal stake in maintaining fairness. Because in a small, tightly interconnected society, your reputation genuinely is your most valuable asset. Mess it up badly enough, and no amount of silver buys it back. Spiritually speaking, let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because the Norse worldview is built around a genuinely staggering cosmic architecture. At the center of everything stands Yggdrasil, a vast ash tree whose branches and roots connect 9 separate realms. Everything from Asgard, home of the gods, to Midgard, the world of humans, to Jotunheim, home of giants, all the way down to Helheim, the realm of the dead. This isn't a distant, abstract mythology either. It's woven into everyday conversation, everyday decision-making, and everyday superstition, the way weather forecasts or horoscopes might casually pepper a modern conversation. Odin sits atop this cosmic structure as the chief god, a one-eyed, endlessly curious figure obsessed with acquiring wisdom, having famously traded one of his own eyes for a drink from the well of knowledge, and hung himself from Yggdrasil itself for 9 days and nights just to learn the secret of the runes. Ever known someone who'd do genuinely uncomfortable things just to seem smarter at parties? Odin took that impulse and applied it at a cosmic scale. Thor, his son, wielding the hammer Mjolnir, is considerably more popular among ordinary farmers and sailors, a straightforward, dependable protector against chaos, giants, and general bad luck. His hammer symbol worn as jewelry by people hedging their spiritual bets, the same way you might wear a lucky charm before a big presentation. Freya and Freyr round out the major figures most relevant to daily life, governing fertility, love, prosperity, and a good harvest. Genuinely practical concerns for a farming society whose entire survival hinges on crops coming in strong each year. But underlying all of this sits a belief that colours everything else. The concept of fate, or weird, an unshakable conviction that the course of a person's life, including the exact circumstances of their death, is already determined, woven by mysterious female beings called the Norns, who tend Yggdrasil's roots. This isn't a passive, fatalistic worldview, though. It's oddly liberating. If your fate is already fixed, regardless of what you do, then the only real choice left is how you meet it, bravely or as a coward, with honour or without. And this belief shapes an entire cultural obsession with reputation and a good death, since your actions can't change your fate, but they absolutely determine how you're remembered. Ragnarok looms over all of this too, a foretold apocalyptic battle where gods, giants and monsters clash in a final catastrophic confrontation, the world ending in fire and flood, only to be reborn afterward, fresh and renewed. It's a genuinely bleak, beautiful piece of cosmology, acknowledging that even the gods themselves are not exempt from an ultimate ending, which somehow makes the whole belief system feel more honest than most. Religious practice itself is largely decentralized. No single priesthood, no central holy text, just household rituals, seasonal blot sacrifices, and feasts marking key points in the farming calendar. Small offerings left at significant natural sites, and a general sense that the gods are present, opinionated, and worth staying on good terms with. It's less organised religion, and more an ongoing, practical relationship with forces you'd rather have on your side. So the next time you knock on wood, or avoid walking under a ladder, know that you're participating in a much older, much grander tradition of hedging your bets against a universe that's already decided how this all ends anyway. Writing here doesn't look anything like a manuscript with flowing script and illuminated letters. It looks like sharp, angular marks carved into stone, bone, wood and metal. A script called runes, specifically the younger Futhark in this era. 16 characters designed from the ground up for cutting rather than flowing, because these letters are meant to be carved with a knife into hard, unforgiving surfaces, not written with ink on soft, forgiving parchment. Every stroke is straight or diagonal, deliberately avoiding curves, since curves are genuinely difficult to carve cleanly into wood grain or stone without a lot of extra effort. Ever tried assembling furniture using instructions that seem to assume you already know exactly what you're doing? Runes carry a similar energy, an efficient, no-nonsense system built entirely around practical constraints rather than aesthetic flourish. Literacy in the modern sense, meaning the ability to read long, complex written texts, isn't widespread here. There's no Norse equivalent of a library stuffed with books, and most day-to-day communication and storytelling happens orally, passed down through memory rather than committed to a page. But runes are still everywhere, once you know where to look. carved onto memorial stones raised along well-travelled roads, commemorating a father, a fallen warrior, or a journey taken to distant lands, often ending with a brief, matter-of-fact statement of who raised the stone and why. These rune stones function almost like a very early, very public form of social media. A permanent, carved announcement broadcasting a family's status, achievements, and grief for anyone passing by to read. Some rune stones simply state facts. Others carry a surprising amount of personality, boasting about how far a relative travelled, how bravely he died, or occasionally including a bit of dry humour that has survived remarkably well across more than 1,000 years. Runes also show up on everyday objects: a bone comb marked with its owner's name, a wooden stick used as an informal message or tally, an amulet carved with protective symbols meant to ward off bad luck or illness. There's genuine evidence of runes used for short, practical messages between merchants, quick notes, ownership marks, even the occasional flirtatious message carved onto a small stick and left for someone specific to find, proving that even 1,000 years ago, people were leaving each other short, slightly awkward notes, hoping to make an impression. Beyond their practical use, runes carry a genuine air of mystery and magic in the Norse imagination. Odin himself is credited with discovering them through considerable personal suffering, and runes are believed to hold protective or even magical properties when carved correctly, used in charms, amulets, and rituals meant to bring luck, ward off harm, or curse an enemy. A carver has to know not just the letters, but the proper context and intention behind carving them, since a rune inscribed carelessly is thought to carry weaker, less reliable power than one carved by someone who genuinely understands what they're doing. This blend of the practical and the mystical runs through the entire system, a writing tool that's simultaneously used for boring inventory lists and for genuinely serious spiritual protection, sometimes on the very same piece of wood. So the next time you jot down a quick reminder on a sticky note, know that you're continuing a tradition stretching back over 1,000 years, minus, hopefully, the part where getting the spelling wrong might curse your household. In the evenings, once the day's chores wind down and the household gathers close around that ever-burning hearth fire, entertainment usually arrives in the form of a skald, part poet, part historian, part professional hype man, whose entire job is reciting verse, often composed on the spot, celebrating heroic deeds, ideally the heroic deeds of whoever happens to be sitting closest to the fire, and, not coincidentally, providing the mead. Skaldic poetry is a genuinely demanding art form, built on strict, complicated meter and a dense web of kennings, elaborate metaphorical phrases used in place of ordinary nouns. So instead of simply saying sea, a skilled skald might say whale road, or instead of blood, might say wound dew, layering meaning and wordplay into every single line. Ever sat through a co-worker's slightly exaggerated retelling of a work accomplishment during a meeting, watching them subtly inflate their own role in whatever actually happened? A skald has essentially professionalized that exact impulse, minus the meeting, plus considerably better wordplay and significantly higher stakes for getting the flattery just right. A truly skilled skald holds real social value and occasionally real political influence, since a chieftain or king's reputation depends heavily on having his deeds celebrated in memorable, widely repeated verse. Poetry composed well enough spreads by word of mouth across entire regions, and a skald's carefully chosen words might genuinely shape how a leader's legacy gets remembered for generations. Which explains why powerful men are often quite generous with skalds, showering them with silver, land, and favour in exchange for the right kind of verse. The performance itself is a genuine event, not background noise. The room quiets, attention turns fully toward the skald, and the recitation, often accompanied by nothing more than the crackle of the fire and maybe a simple stringed instrument, unfolds as serious entertainment, taken every bit as seriously as any modern concert or theatre performance. Beyond individual praise poems, longer narrative works recount the deeds of gods and legendary heroes, stories that will, centuries later, be written down and preserved as the Eddas and sagas modern readers still study, but which exist here purely as spoken performance, memorized, adapted, and passed down through repeated retelling, with each skald bringing their own particular flourishes and phrasing to a familiar story. Memory itself is a genuinely prized skill in this culture, since an entire body of literature, history, law, and genealogy exists only in people's heads, recited aloud at gatherings, funerals, and feasts, with remarkably little committed to any written record. A good memory, paired with a gift for language, makes a skald one of the most respected figures at any gathering, regardless of his standing in terms of land or wealth. There's genuine competitive pressure here too. A poorly composed poem, clumsy metre, an insulting kenning chosen without proper care, can genuinely damage a skald's reputation, or worse, offend the very person he's meant to be flattering, which, in a culture this obsessed with honour, is not a small risk to take lightly. So the fire crackles, the mead flows, and the skald clears his throat, ready to spin tonight's events into something considerably more impressive than they probably actually were. It's the Viking Age equivalent of a really, really elaborate LinkedIn post, except delivered live, in verse, with everyone's full attention and absolutely no way to quietly delete it later if it doesn't land well. Once the harvest is in and the smoking racks hanging from the rafters are properly full, let's talk about the Norse table beyond the basics, because the food here gets considerably more interesting than porridge and dried fish once autumn's bounty comes rolling in. Wild game supplements the household diet significantly, elk, deer and wild boar hunted in the surrounding forests, providing rich, fatty meat that gets roasted over the fire or added to the ever-present simmering stew pot. Seabirds and their eggs, gathered from coastal cliffs in a genuinely precarious annual harvest, add welcome variety, while seal and whale meat, when a stranded or hunted animal provides the opportunity, offer a substantial, if strongly flavoured, boost to the household's fat and protein reserves through the depths of winter. Foraging rounds out the diet beautifully during the brief window when berries ripen across the hillsides and forest floor. Lingonberries, cloudberries, and blueberries gathered in bulk and preserved, sometimes dried, sometimes turned into a thick preserve, providing a rare hit of sweetness and vitamin C in a diet that otherwise runs heavily towards salted, smoked, and fermented foods. Honey, gathered where wild bees can be found, or from carefully tended hives, serves as the primary sweetener available, precious enough that it's used sparingly, saved for special occasions, or mixed into that all-important fermented drink. And then we have to talk about the fermented shark, hakal, made from Greenland shark meat that's actually toxic when fresh due to high concentrations of urea and trimethylamine oxide, requires a genuinely elaborate preparation process, buried and pressed for weeks to let the toxins break down, then hung to dry for months longer, resulting in a food that is, by all honest contemporary and modern accounts, extremely pungent, tasting strongly of ammonia in a way that catches first-time tasters completely off guard. Ever bitten into something you were assured was delicious, only for your face to immediately betray every single thought you were having? That's the traditional first-timer's reaction to hakal, and honestly, it's earned. But the fact that anyone figured out how to make an inherently poisonous fish safely edible at all speaks to a genuinely resourceful culinary tradition born entirely out of necessity. Nothing wasted, every possible food source pushed to its absolute usable limit. Beyond the more challenging items, the Norse table also features skyr regularly, that thick, tangy fermented dairy product related to yogurt, versatile enough to be eaten plain, sweetened with honey and berries, or used as a base for other dishes, and remarkably good at keeping through long stretches of storage. Flatbreads baked on hot stones, root vegetables like turnips and cabbage grown in kitchen gardens, and a wide variety of dried herbs used both for flavour and for their genuine medicinal properties round out a diet that's considerably more varied and thoughtfully constructed than the meat and mead stereotype usually suggests. Feasts, when they happen, marking a good harvest, a successful voyage, or a significant seasonal festival, are genuinely lavish affairs by comparison. Multiple courses of roasted meat, fresh bread, preserved fruit, and plenty of mead and ale, shared communally around the hearth in a display of hospitality that reflects directly on the household's status and generosity. So next time you're hesitant about trying some unfamiliar regional delicacy on vacation, take heart. At least it's probably not fermented shark. And if it is, you're in remarkably good, ammonia-scented company. No gathering here is complete without mead, and honestly, No evening winds down properly without it either. Brewed from fermented honey and water, sometimes flavoured with local herbs, berries or spices when available, mead is the drink most closely associated with Norse hospitality, ceremony, and, let's be honest, genuinely loosened tongues around the fire. Brewing it isn't a quick process. Honey and water fermented together with wild yeast over weeks or months, a batch carefully tended and tasted along the way, since getting the balance wrong means either a disappointingly weak drink or something considerably stronger than intended, and both outcomes carry real social consequences at the next feast. Alongside mead sits ale, brewed from barley, the more everyday drink consumed regularly by the whole household, including, in a weaker form, by children, since it's generally considered safer than untreated water and provides useful calories on top of the mild buzz. Ever had a work happy hour that started reasonably and ended with someone standing on a chair delivering an unnecessarily emotional speech about friendship? The mead hall has been running that exact programme for well over 1,000 years, just with slightly better poetry and a considerably higher tolerance for shouting matches that somehow still count as good hospitality. The mead hall itself, essentially the grandest, most impressive room a chieftain or wealthy landowner can offer, serves as the true centre of Norse social and political life. This is where oaths get sworn, alliances get formed, marriages get negotiated, and disputes occasionally get resolved, or occasionally get considerably worse, all lubricated by a steady flow of drink and an atmosphere thick with expectation. Hospitality here carries enormous cultural weight. A host who fails to provide generously for guests, plenty of mead, plenty of food, a warm welcome regardless of who shows up at the door, risks serious damage to his reputation, since generosity is one of the clearest, most visible markers of status and honour available in this society. Guests, in turn, are expected to offer respect, good conversation, and ideally some entertaining news or storytelling in exchange for the hospitality they're receiving, an unspoken but very real social contract that governs nearly every gathering. Toasts follow a fairly established pattern too, raised first to the gods, thanking them for the harvest, the successful voyage, or simply for another year survived, then to fallen ancestors and relatives, honouring their memory and their ongoing presence in the household's fortunes, and finally to the achievements of whoever's being celebrated that particular evening, a warrior's bravery, a trader's successful voyage, a farmer's excellent harvest. Boasting, far from being considered rude, is practically an expected part of the evening's entertainment, men standing to recount their own deeds or challenging others to match their claims, the whole exchange part performance, part genuine competition for status and respect among peers. It can, admittedly, get out of hand. Grievances resurface, old rivalries flare back up, and more than one Norse saga includes a mead hall gathering that ends considerably more violently than it began. A stark reminder that mixing strong drink, wounded pride, and readily available weapons rarely ends in quiet, peaceful resolution. But on a good night, with the fire crackling, the mead flowing, and old friends trading stories and gentle insults late into the evening, the mead hall represents something genuinely wonderful. Community, warmth, and belonging, hard-won against a genuinely difficult climate and an unpredictable world. Just maybe don't be the one standing on the bench delivering the overly emotional toast. Some traditions, it turns out, really are timeless. Contrary to a lot of modern assumptions built on horned helmets and battle scenes, Norse women held real, meaningful legal standing in this society, considerably more than in many other parts of contemporary medieval Europe. A married woman here retains ownership of her own property and dowry throughout the marriage, meaning her husband can't simply seize or dispose of her assets on a whim, and if the marriage ends, she takes that property with her, a level of financial independence that would genuinely surprise a lot of people still picturing this era as uniformly patriarchal and restrictive. The most visible, literal symbol of this authority hangs quite prominently from her belt. A set of keys, unlocking the chests, storerooms, and outbuildings where the household's food, valuables, and supplies are kept secure. These keys aren't decorative. They represent genuine, exclusive control over the household's resources, and a woman who holds them is, in a very real sense, running the entire domestic economy. Ever met someone who casually controls the office supply closet and, through that one seemingly small responsibility, somehow ends up with more actual day-to-day power than half the management team? That's essentially the Norse housewife with her keyring, except the stakes involve an entire farm's winter survival rather than whether someone can find a working stapler. This authority becomes especially significant given how often the men of the household are simply gone, off trading, raiding, or exploring for months, sometimes years, at a stretch. During these extended absences, running the farmstead falls entirely to the woman of the house, managing the fields, the livestock, the labour, the food stores, and every single decision required to keep the entire operation functioning and profitable. This isn't an informal, temporary arrangement either. It's a widely recognised, expected role. And a woman who runs her household competently during her husband's absence earns real respect and standing within the broader community. Norse women could also, notably, initiate divorce, a rite that genuinely distinguishes this society from a great many of its European contemporaries, where women had far more limited legal recourse to end an unsatisfactory marriage. Grounds for divorce could include a husband's failure to provide adequately for the household, mistreatment, or even something as specific as wearing effeminate clothing, a detail that shows up in later legal texts and hints at just how precisely Norse law tried to define acceptable and unacceptable marital conduct. Women could also bring legal cases to the Thing Assembly directly, particularly regarding property disputes, inheritance, or personal grievances, participating in the same legal system, even if the Assembly's day-to-day proceedings remained heavily dominated by men. There's also solid archaeological evidence of women buried with genuine markers of status and authority, fine jewellery, household tools, and in a few remarkable cases, weapons and equipment, suggesting some women held military or leadership roles as well, though the full extent and frequency of this remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate and discussion. None of this means Norse society operated on anything resembling modern gender equality. Men still held the majority of formal political power. Inheritance customs generally favoured sons, and the legal system as a whole still reflected a fundamentally patriarchal structure. But within that structure, Norse women carved out and maintained a level of practical authority, legal protection, and economic independence that genuinely stands out for the era, running households, managing farms, and holding their own in a legal system that, unlike a lot of its contemporaries, was at least willing to listen. Marriage here is treated less like a fairy tale and considerably more like a carefully negotiated business merger, complete with contracts, financial terms, and, if things go poorly, a surprisingly accessible exit clause. Marriages are typically arranged by the families involved, not out of any particular disregard for the couple's feelings, but because marriage represents a genuinely serious economic and social alliance between two households, one that affects land, wealth, inheritance, and standing for generations to come, and is simply too important to leave entirely to romantic impulse. Negotiations between families cover the practical details in real depth. The size of the bride's dowry, brought into the marriage as her own retained property, alongside a corresponding payment from the groom's family called the mund, essentially a bride price paid to formalise and secure the union. These terms get discussed, debated, and agreed upon with the kind of careful attention modern couples might apply to a mortgage agreement, because, in a very real sense, that's exactly what this is. Ever sat through a mildly tense conversation about a prenuptial agreement and felt like the romance had been slightly deflated by all the paperwork? Norse marriage negotiations operated on that exact energy, just with slightly more livestock involved in the final terms. The wedding ceremony itself, once terms are settled, involves a genuine feast, witnesses present to formally recognise the union, and symbolic gestures meant to bind the couple together in the eyes of both families and the wider community, since without a church or centralised religious authority overseeing marriages, the community's collective recognition and memory of the event serves as the actual legal proof that a marriage took place. Once married, as already established, the wife retains real control over her dowry and household management, running the domestic economy with genuine authority. A partnership of sorts, even if not one built on equal footing by modern standards. That if the marriage genuinely isn't working, divorce here is a considerably more accessible option than in most of contemporary medieval Europe. Either spouse can initiate it, provided they can demonstrate reasonable grounds, and Norse law recognises a fairly specific list of acceptable reasons. A husband failing to adequately provide for his wife and household, serious mistreatment or violence, a husband dressing or behaving in ways considered inappropriately feminine, a specific and genuinely curious detail that shows up repeatedly in later legal sources. A wife could also seek divorce if her husband proved unable to consummate the marriage, or under various other circumstances, the law considered legitimate grievances. The process typically requires the dissatisfied spouse to publicly declare their intent to divorce, sometimes in front of witnesses, at the bed and at the main door of the house, a formal, recognized ritual rather than a quiet, private decision. Upon divorce, The woman takes her dowry and any property she brought into or acquired during the marriage back with her. A genuine financial safety net that meant marriage, however economically important, didn't trap a Norse woman in a hopeless or abusive situation without any legal recourse or resources to fall back on. This entire system reflects a society that, whatever its other limitations, took the practical economic dimensions of marriage extremely seriously, treating it as a genuine partnership with real stakes, real protections, and, crucially, a real, legally recognized way out if the arrangement simply stopped working for either party involved. Childhood here is short, busy, and remarkably fast-tracked toward genuine responsibility, because in a subsistence economy where every single hand contributes to the household's survival, there's simply no room for an idle child, and honestly, not much concept of childhood as its own protected, separate phase of life, the way modern society tends to view it. Children are put to work early, often by the age of 5 or 6, taking on small, manageable tasks, gathering firewood, fetching water, helping tend chickens or goats, gradually building up to more demanding responsibilities as they grow older and stronger. By their early teens, both boys and girls are typically expected to handle a genuinely full share of adult work. Girls learning to spin wool, weave cloth, manage food preservation, and run a household, while boys learn farming, animal husbandry, boat handling, and basic weapon skills, since every free man is expected to be capable of defending his household and community if called upon. Ever watched a modern 10-year-old struggle to load a dishwasher without direct supervision and multiple reminders? Norse children of the same age were routinely trusted with responsibilities that would make most contemporary parents faint, herding livestock alone across open, occasionally dangerous terrain, wielding sharp tools competently, and generally being treated as smaller, still developing adults rather than a fundamentally separate category of person requiring constant protection. This isn't to say childhood here was entirely without warmth or play. Archaeological finds include genuine toys, small wooden boats, carved animal figures, and simple game pieces, suggesting children did have some space for play alongside their work, and the sagas occasionally mention children engaging in wrestling matches, foot races, and mock combat with wooden weapons, activities that doubled as both entertainment and early physical training for adult responsibilities down the line. Education, such as it is, happens entirely through direct observation and hands-on practice, rather than formal schooling. There's no classroom, no curriculum, no standardized instruction. Children learn by watching their parents and older relatives, by being handed increasingly difficult tasks as they demonstrate competence, and by absorbing the household's accumulated practical knowledge, farming techniques, weaving patterns, boat maintenance, storytelling traditions, simply through sustained daily exposure and repetition. Storytelling itself serves an important educational function too. Sagas and myths recited around the evening fire, doing double duty as entertainment and as a way of passing down cultural values, historical knowledge, and practical wisdom framed within memorable, engaging narratives. Naming and identity carry real weight from a young age as well. A child's name often connects them directly to an ancestor or relative, reinforcing family lineage and continuity, and formal acknowledgement of a newborn by the father, accepting the child into the family rather than the alternative practice of exposure, which did occur in cases of severe poverty or perceived deformity, a difficult and uncomfortable reality of the era's harsh economic constraints, represents the child's first, most fundamental step into the community. Coming of age isn't marked by a single dramatic ceremony, so much as a gradual accumulation of skills, responsibilities, and trust. A young person slowly recognized as fully adult once they've demonstrated genuine competence in the tasks expected of them, marriage, and often participation in their first serious voyage or thing assembly. It's a childhood built entirely around practical necessity rather than extended protection, difficult by modern standards, but one that produced remarkably capable, self-sufficient adults by the time they reached what we'd now still consider their teenage years. When conflict does arrive, and in a society this deeply invested in personal honor and reputation, it arrives with some regularity. It comes primarily by axe, spear, and round wooden shield, wielded overwhelmingly by farmers rather than professional soldiers, men who trained just enough in their spare time to be genuinely dangerous when the situation demanded it. The axe is probably the single most iconic Norse weapon, and for good reason, since it's cheap to produce, doubles as an everyday farming and woodworking tool, and requires considerably less specialized metalworking than a proper sword, which remains a genuinely expensive, high-status weapon owned mainly by wealthier warriors and chieftains. A sword here isn't just a weapon, it's a status symbol, often inherited, sometimes given a personal name, and treated with the kind of reverence modern people might reserve for a genuinely significant family heirloom. Ever inherited something from a relative that you're terrified of accidentally damaging, so it just sits carefully displayed rather than actually being used for its intended purpose? Norse sword owners had that exact energy, except their heirloom was specifically designed to end someone's life efficiently, and they still occasionally had to actually use it that way. Spears, considerably more affordable and easier to produce than swords, remain the most common weapon among ordinary farmer warriors, effective both for thrusting in close combat and for throwing, and versatile enough to double as a hunting tool when there isn't an actual battle to attend to. The round wooden shield, faced with leather and fitted with an iron boss at the centre to protect the gripping hand, forms the core of basic defensive technique. Warriors standing shoulder to shoulder in a rough shield wall formation, overlapping shields to present a solid, difficult-to-penetrate front against an advancing enemy. Armour, contrary to popular depictions, is relatively minimal for most fighters. A simple padded or leather garment for those who can't afford better, with genuine mail shirts reserved for wealthier warriors and chieftains who can afford the enormous amount of skilled labour required to produce one, since a single mail shirt might involve tens of thousands of individually linked iron rings, representing a serious investment of both material and time. Helmets, when worn at all, are simple, practical iron or leather caps, notably without horns, a detail modern popular culture has stubbornly refused to correct, despite there being essentially no genuine historical or archaeological evidence supporting horned battle helmets, which would have been impractical, dangerous to the wearer in close combat, and frankly, an easy handle for an enemy to grab. Training happens informally, practiced during the calmer stretches of farm life, wrestling matches, mock combat with wooden weapons, and regular practice with bow and spear during hunting, gradually building the physical conditioning and basic combat skill that a genuine battle demands. Berserkers, warriors said to fight in a genuinely wild, near uncontrollable rage, possibly induced through ritual, herbal preparation, or simple psychological conditioning, occupy a particularly mythologized corner of Norse warrior culture, their historical reality considerably more debated among scholars than popular depictions tend to suggest. Underlying all of this combat culture sits the deep, pervasive belief in reputation and a good death. Dying bravely in battle considered a genuinely honorable, even desirable outcome, securing a place in Valhalla, according to the mythology, and ensuring one's deeds get remembered and recited by skalds for generations. It's a warrior culture built as much around social standing and remembered honor as around actual military tactics, which explains a great deal about why so many Norse conflicts, even relatively minor personal disputes, could escalate so quickly into genuine violence. Reputation in this world is worth fighting and occasionally dying for. Death here comes with real, deliberate ceremony, because how you're sent off matters just as much, culturally speaking, as how you actually lived. And Norse burial customs reflect a genuine, careful belief that the afterlife journey requires proper preparation. The specifics vary considerably depending on wealth, status, and regional custom, but common threads run throughout. Many burials involve a mound, earth piled over the grave, sometimes modest, sometimes genuinely massive for a wealthy or powerful individual, creating a lasting, visible landmark in the landscape that serves simultaneously as a memorial and as a physical assertion of a family's ongoing claim to that land and its history. Grave goods accompany the deceased in remarkable variety: tools, weapons, jewelry, food, and household items, all selected based on what the dead person might genuinely need in the next life, reflecting a very literal, practical approach to the afterlife rather than a purely symbolic one. A blacksmith might be buried with his tools, a warrior with his weapons and shield, a woman of status with her jewelry, weaving equipment, and household keys, the same keys that represented her authority in life, continuing to symbolize that same authority in whatever comes next. Ever carefully packed a suitcase for a trip, triple checking you had everything you might possibly need? Norse burial preparation runs on that exact same anxious, thorough energy, just applied to an infinitely longer journey with considerably higher stakes. The most dramatic and famous form of Norse burial, though genuinely reserved for the wealthiest and most powerful individuals, is the ship burial. The deceased laid out within an actual ship, sometimes a full seaworthy vessel, sometimes a smaller ceremonial boat, surrounded by grave goods, occasionally accompanied by sacrificed animals, and in some documented cases, described in later written accounts, by a sacrificed slave as well, before the entire assembly is covered with an earthen mound. The ship itself carries clear symbolic weight, the vessel meant to carry the deceased onward into the afterlife, the same way it once carried them across open water, a literal vehicle for the soul's continuing journey. Cremation, alternatively, is also widely practiced across much of the Norse world. The body burned on a pyre along with grave goods, the ashes then buried or scattered, sometimes within a boat-shaped stone setting marking the gravesite, even without an actual physical ship present. The stones arranged specifically to evoke a vessel's silhouette. Funeral rites themselves involve genuine ceremony, feasting, the recitation of the deceased's deeds and lineage by a skald or family member, and ritual offerings meant to honor both the dead individual and the gods overseeing their passage into whichever afterlife realm awaits them. Valhalla, for warriors who died bravely in battle, Folkvanga, under the goddess Freya's domain, or the considerably less glamorous Helheim, for those who died of illness or old age rather than in combat. This distinction matters enormously to Norse understanding of a good death versus an ordinary one, reinforcing that same cultural emphasis on honor and reputation, extending even into how the afterlife itself gets sorted and organized. Mourning practices, memorial runestones raised along roadsides commemorating the dead, and the ongoing telling and retelling of a person's deeds around the hearth fire all work together to ensure the deceased isn't simply forgotten, their memory actively maintained and honored by the living community for years, sometimes generations, afterward. It's a death culture built on the conviction that the end of physical life isn't really the end at all, just a transition requiring careful, thoughtful preparation, and one final, genuinely important journey still ahead. Let's talk about the sky itself, because the Scandinavian calendar swings between genuinely brutal extremes that shape nearly every aspect of daily life here. Winter, particularly in the far north, brings weeks of near-total darkness, the sun barely, if ever, clearing the horizon, casting the entire landscape into a perpetual dim twilight that stretches from what should be morning straight through what should be evening. Cold settles in deep and stays, snow and ice locking down the fjords and farmland alike, and daily life contracts accordingly, most work happening indoors, the household clustering close around that essential hearth fire, mending tools, weaving cloth, and telling the same stories they've told 100 times before, because there's genuinely little else to do once the fields are frozen solid and the ships are pulled up onto shore for the season. Ever felt that specific late January exhaustion when it feels like the sun set 3 hours ago and it's still only mid-afternoon? Now imagine that feeling stretched across roughly 2 straight months, with your only source of artificial light being a smoky fire and maybe a small oil lamp if the household can spare the fuel. Then summer arrives and the entire equation flips dramatically. In the far north, the sun barely sets at all for weeks at a stretch, the sky staying bright, or at least dimly lit, through what should technically be the middle of the night, a phenomenon that genuinely disrupts sleep patterns and daily rhythms for anyone not accustomed to it. This midnight sun period is, somewhat counterintuitively, an incredibly productive season, since the extended daylight allows for genuinely long working days, planting, tending, and harvesting crops during a growing season that's already painfully short by more temperate European standards. Every extra hour of usable daylight mattering enormously to the household's survival through the following winter. Fishing, too, extends deep into these bright nights. Boats heading out under a sky that never quite commits to darkness, taking full advantage of a resource that will become considerably harder to access once winter locks the water up again. Both seasons demand genuinely different survival skills, and Norse communities develop clear, practical strategies for each. Winter requires careful resource management above all else, precisely calculating how much stored food, fuel, and fodder will last through the dark months, since running short in February, with weeks of winter still ahead, is a genuinely life-threatening miscalculation rather than a minor inconvenience. Indoor crafts and skills get the bulk of attention during this period too. Weaving, woodworking, tool repair, and storytelling filling the long, dark hours when outdoor farm work simply isn't possible. Summer, by contrast, demands an almost relentless work ethic, cramming an entire year's worth of farming, fishing, trading, and building into the brief window when weather and daylight both cooperate, since the household's entire annual survival essentially gets decided during these few frantic, sun-drenched months. This extreme seasonal rhythm shapes festivals and religious observance too. Midsummer celebrated with genuine enthusiasm and considerable feasting, marking the peak of light and the corresponding peak of agricultural activity, while midwinter brings its own significant bloat sacrifice and feast, a communal acknowledgement of the darkest, hardest stretch of the year, and a hopeful nod toward the returning light still months away. It's a life lived in genuine rhythm with extreme natural cycles. Most modern people, cocooned in artificial lighting and climate control, rarely have to consciously reckon with at all. So the next time daylight saving time throws your sleep schedule off by a single measly hour, spare a thought for an entire society that adjusted, twice a year, to literal months of either near total darkness or near total daylight, and somehow still managed to get the harvest in on time. Let's step back and look at just how far this supposedly remote corner of the world actually reaches, because Norse trade routes and voyages stretch across an astonishing, genuinely surprising distance, connecting Scandinavian farmsteads to a network spanning much of the known medieval world. To the west, Norse sailors reach the British Isles regularly, raiding, trading, and eventually settling significant portions of England, Scotland, and Ireland, founding towns like Dublin that remain major cities to this day, a detail that consistently surprises people who don't realise just how much of Ireland's early urban development traces directly back to Norse settlement. Iceland gets settled by Norse farmers seeking fresh land beginning in the 9th century, followed shortly after by Greenland, and eventually, briefly, a small settlement in North America itself, centuries before anyone else in Europe managed the crossing. Evidence found at a site in Newfoundland confirming Norse presence in the Americas roughly 500 years before a certain famous Italian sailor gets credited with the discovery in most standard history books. Ever had a friend accomplish something impressive
and then watch someone else take all the credit for it decades or centuries later. Norse explorers have been dealing with that exact frustration since roughly the year 1000. To the east, the reach is arguably even more surprising.
Norse traders, known in this direction as the Rus, travel along Russia's major river systems, the Volga and Dnieper, providing a water highway deep into the heart of Eastern Europe and beyond, trading furs, amber, and slaves for silver and luxury goods, eventually establishing trading posts and settlements that play a genuinely significant role in the early formation of what becomes the Kievan Rus, and by extension, the eventual foundations of modern Russia and Ukraine. These river routes eventually connect Norse traders all the way to Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, where Norse merchants and mercenaries, some serving in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard, encounter a level of urban sophistication, wealth, and luxury goods considerably beyond anything available back home in Scandinavia. Silk, spices, fine glassware, and Arab silver coins called dirhams flow back along these same routes, genuinely surprising archaeological evidence turning up in Norse graves and hoards, testifying to trade connections stretching all the way to Baghdad and the wider Islamic world. A level of long-distance commercial reach that consistently upends the popular image of isolated, provincial Viking farmers who never travelled beyond their own fjord. This vast trading and raiding network also means Norse society absorbs genuine outside influence in return: foreign goods, foreign ideas, and eventually, foreign religion, since increased contact with Christian Europe through trade, raiding, and mercenary service gradually introduces Christianity into Norse society, a process that accelerates significantly as this era progresses and eventually reshapes Scandinavian religious and political life entirely. Norse mercenaries also serve various foreign rulers directly, the aforementioned Varangian Guard in Constantinople being the most famous example. Elite warriors specifically prized by Byzantine emperors for their fierce reputation and, notably, their lack of entanglement in local Byzantine political intrigue, making them considerably more trustworthy bodyguards than homegrown alternatives with their own competing loyalties and ambitions. So this supposedly remote, isolated corner of the medieval world turns out to be remarkably well connected, its farmers, traders and warriors reaching from the shores of North America clear across to the gates of Constantinople, several centuries before most of the rest of Europe managed anything close to that same geographic reach. Not bad at all for a society running entirely on wind, awe, and sheer, unshakable confidence. As the fire burns low and the household finally settles onto its sleeping platforms for the night, animals and all, the noise of the day finally quiets into something almost peaceful, and it's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much has happened between this morning's smoky, chaotic wake-up and this exact moment. The hearth, tended so carefully all day, gets banked down for the night, coals raked together and covered just enough to keep a living ember through until morning, without burning through the household's carefully rationed firewood. The animals at the far end of the Longhouse settle into their own quiet shuffling and occasional soft grumbling. The shared warmth between human and livestock quarters doing exactly what it's meant to do, keeping the whole structure just bearable against the deep chill pressing in from outside. Ever had one of those nights where the house finally goes quiet? The dishwasher's humming, everyone's tucked in, and there's a strange, hard-won peace to it after a genuinely chaotic day. That's this exact moment, just with considerably more livestock and significantly less indoor plumbing. Conversation winds down gradually rather than stopping abruptly, low voices trading a few last bits of news, a final comment about tomorrow's chores, maybe a quiet word of thanks to whichever god feels most relevant that particular evening. Someone might still be working with their hands even now, mending a torn seam or carving a small tool by the last of the firelight, since idle hands are, in this economy, a genuine luxury nobody can quite afford, even in these final quiet minutes before sleep. Children, worn out from a full day of real, meaningful chores rather than idle boredom, drop off quickly, tucked close for warmth among siblings and parents on the shared sleeping platforms lining the walls. The smell of smoke, animal, and unwashed wool that seemed so overwhelming this morning has by now simply become the ambient, unnoticed backdrop of home, the way any familiar smell eventually stops registering entirely to the people who live inside it every single day. Outside, depending on the season, either genuine darkness presses against the turf walls, or a strange, lingering summer twilight refuses to fully commit to nightfall, and either way, the household inside has learned to sleep regardless, adjusting instinctively to whatever the sky outside happens to be doing that particular week. There's a profound, hard-won intimacy to this nightly ritual. An entire household, human and animal alike, packed into one long shared room, bound together by mutual need, shared warmth, and the simple practical understanding that surviving this climate, this era, this specific demanding way of life requires everyone pulling together every single day, without exception. It's not comfortable by modern standards, it's not private, and it's certainly not quiet in any conventional sense. But it is, in its own smoky, crowded, thoroughly Norse way, genuinely, stubbornly cozy. A shared warmth built entirely out of necessity that somehow, against all odds, still manages to feel a whole lot like home. And somewhere in that darkness, the fire holds its quiet ember through till morning, patiently waiting to be coaxed back to life one more time tomorrow. Sources consulted for historical and cultural accuracy. The National Museum of Denmark's Viking Age collections and educational materials. The British Museum's Viking exhibition resources. Neil Price's Children of Ash and Elm. Judith Jesch's work on Viking Age society and women's roles. The Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde on shipbuilding techniques. University of Oslo's Museum of Cultural History, Runestone and Rune Database. Anders Vinroth's The Age of the Vikings, and the Smithsonian's coverage of Lance au Meadow and Norse North American settlement. Let's bring this long night in Viking Age Scandinavia gently to a close. You've woken up in a smoky longhouse, shared your bed with an entire extended family and their livestock, and somehow found that oddly comforting rather than alarming. You've watched a ship take shape, plank by plank, trusted your life to a shadow on a wooden disc somewhere out on the open Atlantic, and stood in a crowded, chaotic market where silver got weighed instead of counted. You've sat through arguments settled not by kings, but by ordinary free men gathered in a field, learned that a woman's keys carried real authority, and discovered that even fate itself was something you were simply expected to meet with a bit of dignity. It was loud, smoky, occasionally terrifying, and remarkably, stubbornly alive. Behind all of it stood people who worked an unforgiving climate with nothing but wool, wood, iron, and sheer persistence, who buried their dead with the same care they gave their living, and who somehow turned a thin strip of rocky coastline into a network that reached from the shores of North America to the gates of Constantinople. They weren't the horned helmet caricatures history sometimes remembers. They were farmers first, sailors by necessity, and remarkably resourceful people who made a genuinely hard life work, season after season, generation after generation. So tonight, as you sink into your own quiet bed, warm, dry, and blessedly free of livestock, maybe send a small thank you toward that smoky hearth fire that never quite went out. Be grateful for your central heating, your running water, and the fact that your dinner doesn't require months of fermentation and a strong stomach. And maybe let a little of that old Norse resolve settle in with you too, that quiet, steady confidence that whatever tomorrow brings, you'll meet it well. Sleep well. The fire's banked, the ship's ashore, and the long winter dark can wait until morning.